So this movie is about autosave and auto-recover, which is something was alluded to in an earlier movie. We're going to begin by looking at the autosave and auto-recover options backstage. And then we're going to recover a saved version, an auto-saved version of our workbook. And then we're going to recover an unsaved draft version, which might sound a little logically inconsistent because in order to recover it, it has to be saved, which it is. We just don't save it. Excel does. And then we're going to take a look at auto-recover. So I've got a workbook, and I have the word original that I put into the workbook. We're going to go backstage and take a look at the autosave and auto-recover options by going to Alt-F-T-S for the Save Excel options. The first option in the first group, the Save Workbooks group, allows us to choose what format we want to automatically save our workbooks in. We can choose any one of the formats that we've seen also in a prior movie. The Excel workbook is the default format. I'm going to leave it at that. The next option, Save Auto Recover Information Every, and I have it set to 2 minutes. The default is 10 minutes, but you can set it anywhere from 1 minute to 120 minutes. What this does is establish the interval of time that passes when you're working in your workbook for which Excel will save automatically a version of that workbook that you can then divert back to should you find it necessary to do that. I will say that time periods less than a couple of minutes don't seem to be acted upon. I can set it to 1 minute and Excel doesn't actually save the spreadsheet every minute. Of course, how many changes can you make in a minute anyway? But be that as it may, you can set this from 1 to 120 minutes. Sometimes it doesn't actually save it in that interval that you're establishing. The next option, keep the last autosave version if I close without saving, is where Excel will, when you make some changes in a workbook and close that workbook without saving it, retain a copy of that so that you can divert back to that workbook. So it will step in and save your changes for you if you don't do it. And it'll save it in the location that's in the next line, the auto-recover file location, and that's the default location. In the center of the dialog box, auto-recover exceptions for, you can define or identify a workbook and disable the auto-recover for the workbook. Not sure why anybody would really want to do that, but you can. So I want to escape out of that. So what I'm going to do is make a change in this workbook. I'm just going to put the word change in that cell. We're going to wait for autosave to save a version of this workbook. So I've waited a few minutes. You can't tell. I just turned off the recording of the movie. And I'm going to go back to Alt-F, and I have a version that was saved. I can click on that version, and that workbook, the version of this workbook, is opened up. And at this point, I actually have two windows that are open, and I can show you that by going to the View tab and left-click Switch Windows. And you can see I have the current workbook is listed first. It's got a check mark. That's the active workbook. That's the auto-saved version. And I have the original version of the workbook. So I can divert back to this saved version, and I get a warning that says you are about to overwrite the last saved version with the selected version, the version that's the active workbook from the auto-save list. I'm going to left-click OK, and I've diverted back to the auto-saved version of the workbook. Another safety net that Excel provides you with is that it steps in and saves the current version of your workbook if you close Excel without saving your workbook that has changes in it. And those can be found by going to Alt-F, Manage Versions, Recover Unsaved Workbooks, click on that, and you're taken to the default location where Excel will store these unsaved draft versions of your workbook that, again, are created when you close Excel without saving your workbook. These are maintained for 4 days automatically, and then they're deleted. So this is yet one more safety net that Excel provides you with to save you from yourself. The catch is that Excel would have had to save a version of your workbook for it to generate this unsaved draft version. So I'm going to close this. The last functionality, support functionality that I'm going to talk about that can save you from yourself or save you from Excel itself or an unstable system is AutoRecover. AutoRecover will present to you in a task pane the workbooks that you have open in the event that Excel crashes. And I can actually simulate a crash by shutting down the computer without closing Excel, which you probably really shouldn't do that, but I'm going to do that to show you the task pane that I just referred to. So I've shut the computer down and fired everything back up, and I'm going to go inside Excel. And there's the document recovery task pane that I mentioned. The available file is book 1. So in the event that Excel crashes or your system crashes, Excel will capture a version of each one of those workbooks and display them on this task pane for you to divert back to. And to do that, I can just click it, and since I'm done, I can close the task pane, and I've recovered my workbook. So that's AutoSave and AutoRecover. We began by looking at the AutoSave options and the AutoRecover options that have different settings. We can determine what file format to save the workbook in. We can determine the interval of time for which Excel will save a version of our workbook. We can have Excel save an AutoSave version if I close without saving the workbook. And I can determine a location where AutoRecover will save the unsaved draft versions of the workbook too. We then recovered a saved version of our workbook that is saved at an interval of time that we set, anywhere from 1 to 120 minutes. We can divert back to one of those saved versions. We can recover a draft version, which is a version that gets saved in the event that we close the workbook without saving it. Those unsaved draft versions are maintained for 4 days. And again, we can divert back to that version of our workbook. And finally, we talked about AutoRecover, where if there's a system crash or Excel crashes, when you reopen up Excel, Excel will display a task pane that will enable you to recover your workbook.